Let's talk about Daniel for a little while this evening, starting with Daniel 1. We'll make our way through other texts in the book of Daniel. But I want to begin by noticing that Daniel was a man who obtained preeminence, prominence, and power. He started out being preeminent among the children of Israel. Go to Daniel chapter 1. You are, I'm understanding, to be generally familiar at least with the story of Daniel. Everyone present should be. And so we're not going to retell the whole story of Daniel, but pick out several sections with which we probably are no doubt familiar. Daniel chapter 1. Daniel, remember, was in captivity. And this book opens with him being in Babylonian captivity, and then we have him by chapter 6 under Persian rule, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But beginning at verse 3, the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick in understanding, who had the ability to serve the king's palace, with whom they might teach the languages and the literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed the daily provisions of the king's delicacies, of the wine which they drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. And now among them were the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave these names, and we'll talk about those names a little bit later. But I want you to see that in verses 3 to 6 of chapter 1, that he was, as the king was looking for preeminent and prominent, notable men of wisdom and understanding and good looking, were among those was a man named Daniel. He started out being preeminent among the children of Israel. Same chapter, chapter 1, we're going to see that he was given power in Babylon rule. Chapter 1, verse 17 beginning, that these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in all the literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And verse 18 says, now at the end of these days, when the king had said they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before King Nebuchadnezzar. Now I want to jump over to chapter 2. This makes the point even stronger of what we're wanting to see. In Daniel chapter 2, as Daniel had interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the text says, then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering, an incense to him. And the king answered and said, truly your God is the God of gods and the Lord of the kings and revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret, since you could, in other words, interpret the dream. Now verse 48, then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gates of the king. What I want you to see is that he started out as a prominent man, preeminent among the children of Israel, one of the notables among them, and then he was given power over the realm of Babylon during the Babylonian rule. Well, in going over to chapter 6 now, we change time frame. In chapter 6, he received similar power under the Medo-Persian Empire. So let's jump over to chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. Darius was set over the kingdom. Let's back up to the end of chapter 5. You'll see that that very night Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So now there's been a shift in power. Now at verse 1, it pleased Darius, who is the Medo-Persian ruler, to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, and that he set over them so that he would suffer no loss. Now verse 3, then Daniel distinguished himself among the governors and the satrap because of the excellent spirit that was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. That's enough to make our point. And then you see a little bit later at verse 28 of the same text, Daniel chapter 6 and verse 28, so Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So what we're seeing in this is that Daniel was a preeminent and prominent man. He had power over Babylon, and he had power in the Medo-Persian Empire. Now here's what I want us to see. That here was a man who understood how to enjoy success without compromise. That all through the book of Daniel, you see a man who never compromised, and yet he enjoyed success and blessings. We're going to focus on Daniel chapter 1, and Daniel chapter 6. So let's talk about daring to be a Daniel. Would you dare to be like Daniel that you read about in Daniel 1 or in Daniel chapter 6? There are 4 things I want us to see about Daniel. Here is the first. Daniel was a man of purpose. Daniel was a man of purpose. Let's go to chapter 1 now and in verse 8. You remember as he was chosen as one of the significant men from the children of Israel to come and serve the king. Daniel chapter 1 now and in verse 8 says, when they offered before him the king's delicacies, verse 8 said, but Daniel purposed, here's our word, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Daniel purposed in his heart. That tells me Daniel was a man who was a man of purpose. Now Daniel was certainly a young man as the book opens up, and he's an old man by the time the book ends. But at this point Daniel is a young man. Furthermore, he was a man who lived in a strange land. He's not among the children of Israel. By that I'm seeing he's not dwelling in the land of Israel. He's in the land of Babylon. He is in a strange land. And thirdly, he's now facing a challenge before him. Now I want to suggest to you that any one of those 3 things could be indeed a problem for Daniel as he is facing a challenge. That is, he's facing a challenge that causes him could cause anyone just to cave into the challenge. Or living in a strange land when there's pressure around him to adapt to culture around him, or being in his youth, he may not have the strength of one who is much older. But Daniel, though he was a man of youth, he was a man of purpose. Though Daniel was in a strange land, he was a man of purpose. And though Daniel was facing a challenge, he was facing something with a purpose. Now his purpose was, according to chapter 1 and verse 8, was to uphold the law of God no matter what. Now what was involved in the king's delicacies that he would not partake? I'm not sure. It may have been that it was something that was eaten in honor of an idol, and he couldn't conscientiously do that. And therefore he was going to try to follow the law of God. Or it may be, as some have suggested, that the meat was forbidden as per Leviticus chapter 11, and therefore he's not going to eat of that in harmony with the law of God. Others have suggested maybe the meat wasn't bled properly, and consequently in Leviticus 17 he was not going to eat. But the point is, his purpose was, I'm going to follow and uphold the law of God no matter what. He had a plan, and he followed the plan. He had a purpose in mind, and because of that he was given favor. Now let's go to chapter 1 beginning at verse 9. Verse 8 is the one that said Daniel purposed in his heart. Now notice that God brought Daniel into favor and the goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. He was blessed. Now let's go to beginning at verse 10. The chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. That is, I'm standing in fear of the king himself, who told us to give you this kind of delicacy and the wine, etc. He's told us to do that. Now notice this phrase at verse 10. For why should your faces look worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. What I'm learning from that is this is a serious matter. This is not a light thing that I don't want to eat of that, and that's not a big deal. It doesn't bother you, and doesn't bother me, doesn't bother the king. But this was a serious matter. The king may take the eunuch's head off, and ultimately their head off, if things don't go well. So this is a serious matter. But Daniel said, I'm not going to partake. I've purposed in my heart. So Daniel said to the steward, to the chief of the eunuchs, who had set over Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants 10 days, and give them vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then let their countenance be examined, he said, verse 13, and the countenance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you, notice this phrase, as you see fit, so deal with your servants. Let's put this to the test, and however it turns out, you deal with us as you see fit. I'm willing to accept the consequences of what I've purposed in my heart. This is a serious matter, but I'll take whatever comes my way. Well, you know the rest of the story, that Daniel and his men looked 10 times greater than those that had eaten of the king's delicacies, and consequently he was blessed because of that. Now, I want you to consider with me that every Christian also needs to be a person of purpose just like Daniel. Go back to chapter 1 and in verse 8 and see if this describes you. The text says in chapter 1 and verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Does that describe you? You see, no one respects a wishy-washy person. If you're like me, you respect someone who does wrong, and yet they admit they're doing wrong, and they are determined to do wrong, and they say that's the direction they want to go, far more than someone who claims to be doing right, but they're wishy-washy. They have no purpose. They have no dedication, and they have no devotion. Let's talk about the purpose of the Christian. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and in verse 9. Have you made a purpose in your heart? Do you have a plan that you're going to follow? This is what you're going to do, and this is how you're going to do it. Notice in chapter 5 and in verse 9. This is a chapter where Paul is saying, this is what makes me do what I do. This is my purpose. This is my drive. This is what makes me act like I act. What is it, Paul? Look at verse 9. Therefore we make it our aim. You might supplant the word purpose. This is our purpose, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to Him. What's your purpose, Paul? I notice that Daniel purposed in his heart. Paul, what have you purposed in your heart? Notice at verse 9 he said, I purpose to be well-pleasing to the Lord. I just want to please the Lord and do what He wants me to do. You are familiar with Ecclesiastes 12 and in verse 13 to hear the conclusion of the matter, to fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. This is man's purpose in life. And because of that we will be blessed, just like Daniel was blessed. We need to take risks just like Daniel because of the purpose in our heart, but we'll likewise be blessed. The eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and His ears are open unto their prayers. Now listen to this carefully. This is a decision that we make long before the crisis. Go back to chapter 1 and verse 8. I do not take it that Daniel, when facing the crisis, and suddenly there set before him the king's delicacies, that he's running things over in his mind real quick. Now, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What should I do? I need to make a decision. I need to have a purpose. I need to have some direction in my life. But rather, this was a decision that he made long before the crisis ever hit. So when the crisis hits, he knew ahead of time what he was going to do. I'm going to follow the law of God. I'm going to follow the direction of God. I'm going to do what's right. Now, when tempted to do otherwise, I'm going to do what's right. This is a decision made long before the crisis ever hits. If you wait till the crisis and then you begin to try to decide, what's my purpose? What am I going to do? How am I going to act? You're liable to go in the wrong direction. Daniel purposed in his heart. Dare to be a Daniel. Daniel was a man of purpose. But not only that, Daniel was a man of purpose, but Daniel was a man of principle. Daniel was a man of purpose, but Daniel was a man of principle. What do we mean by that? Daniel refused to compromise his conviction. He had a plan. He had a purpose. I'm going to follow it. But not only that, he was a man of conviction. He was a man of principle. As a young man, he refused something, as we've already noted. So let's notice again in chapter 1 and verse 8. When he was a young man, this is early in his life, he refused the king's meat with the king's delicacies. We just read that in chapter 1 and verse 8. And so he was a man of conviction and he was a man of principle. I'm not going to partake of that. Even though it's a serious matter, someone's head may be taken off. That doesn't matter to me. I'm going to do what I know to be right. Now let's jump ahead later in his life, chapter 5. Chapter 5, he's now getting to be an older man by chapter 5. At the end of the Babylonian Empire, and as an older man, he refused Belshazzar's gift. You remember as Belshazzar was looking for someone to explain the handwriting on the wall. And they called for Daniel, and he says to Daniel, verse 14, I have heard of you. I've heard about you. I've heard about how you have enlightenment and understanding and excellent wisdom, and they are found in you. I've heard all about that. And I noticed at verse 17 or verse 16, he said, I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known the interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and third ruler in the kingdom. I'm going to give you all these gifts. If you can explain this handwriting on the wall, I want you to notice what he said. Daniel answered and said, let your gifts be to yourself and give your rewards to another, yet I will read the writing for the king and make known to him the interpretation. In other words, I'm not for sale. In other words, he refused the king's meats when he was a young man. As he's an older man, I'm not interested in your gifts. I'm not going to give you the correct interpretation if you give me a great sum. If you give me great gifts, I'm going to explain it to you, and I don't want you to give me your gifts. I'm not for sale. He's a man of conviction. He's a man of principle. Let's go to chapter 6 now, one chapter over. And I want you to notice that when he was threatened with the lion's den, we'll talk about the circumstance of that in a moment, but when he was threatened with the lion's den, he refused the decree. The decree was that no one is to offer a petition to anyone other than the king. And you'll recall how that in Daniel chapter 6 and in verse 10, that when Daniel knew the writing was signed, he knew what the law of the Persians were. He knew what it was. That he went to his upper room and he opened his window toward Jerusalem and he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and he prayed and gave thanks to God, as was his custom since the early days. I want you to notice he was a man of conviction and a man of principle because he didn't change over time. Not only did he refuse that decree, chapter 6, verse 10, but that same passage says that he had done this since the early days. See, he was a young man and he was doing that. And when he's a middle-aged man, he was doing that. And when he's an old man, he's still doing that. He hasn't changed. He's a man of conviction. He's a man of principle. People admire those of principle. It may be that you'll be ridiculed. And people may make fun of you for your principle, but often inwardly they want the same thing that you have. You have conviction, you have principle about you, and yet they ridicule the principle you stand on. And that you are a Bible thumper, that you are the kind of person that sticks to your guns about principle, but they often admire that very same thing. When someone of principle is needed, who do they turn to? They turn to those who stick to their principles. Now let's go to Psalm 15. I want to look at a couple of passages. God commends the very spirit of principle that we see in Daniel. So let's go to the 15th Psalm now, and notice it's a very short psalm. But the question is, there's a question raised in Psalm 15 to which God gives an answer. And here's the question. Verse 1 said, "Who will abide in your tabernacle and who will dwell in your holy hill?" In other words, who will have fellowship with God and who will be with God in the after while? We might word that, who's going to be faithful to God, who's considered a faithful servant of God and will go to heaven in the after while. Who is that? And here's the answer beginning at verse 2. I want you to watch for a couple of times. In fact, all of the phrases may come under this banner of principle and conviction, but 2 particular I want us to pay attention to. Look at verse 2. Here's the one that is in fellowship with God. God gives his approval to. God commends. One who walks uprightly. That's principle, isn't it? And who works righteousness, speaks truth in his heart. That's a person of principle. And does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised. And he honors those who fear the Lord, and he swears to his own hurt. Now notice this phrase. He swears to his own hurt and does not change. In other words, he gives his word. And even though it's harmful to him, he's going to stick to his guns because he's a person of principle. God admires that. God commends that. And in verse 5, nor does he put out his hand to usury. He's a person of principle. Nor does he take bribe among the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. God commends that. Now let's go over to the book of Exodus. This is quite interesting. You remember as God, through Moses, was dealing with Pharaoh. And as Moses talks to Pharaoh, Pharaoh makes a promise that he's going to let the children go, and then he backs away from his promise. And then he does that again, and he backs away from his promise. Pharaoh turns out to be a man who has no principle at all about him. But Moses is a man of principle. He's a man of conviction. And notice what happens now concerning this plague of darkness, that Pharaoh cried out to Moses and said at verse 24, "Go serve, but only let your flocks and your herds be kept back." Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let your people go, and you take them and you leave, but you leave all of your herd back behind. And notice what Moses said. Look at verse 26. He said, "Our livestock shall go with us, and not a hoof shall be left behind." We're not going to compromise one hoof of one cow. We're not going to leave one hoof of one cow behind. We're going to stand on principle. God said, let the people go. That includes their possession. And we're going to take those with us. He was a man of principle, and God commends that. A person of principle stands and will not move. And Moses wouldn't move, nor would Daniel move. Well, what do we know about Daniel? Dare to be a Daniel. Daniel was a man of purpose. He had made this determination, I'm going to follow God's law and I'm not going to veer from it. He was also a man of principle. But also, thirdly, I want you to notice he was a man of purity. Daniel was a man of purity. Now let's notice he was a man of purity because his opponents could not find fault with him. Now, we can notice this in chapter 1. We're not going to take the time to go again to Daniel 1 at this moment, but you remember how he refused to partake of the king's delicacies? That would argue for his purity. But let's go to chapter 6 now of the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 6. Now we're under the Medo-Persian rule later in the life of Daniel. And I want you to notice that he was found to be faultless in his business matters as he is handling things for the Medo-Persians, just like he did for the Babylonians. Now we begin again at verse 1, that it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 100 satraps, and over these 3 governors. And dropping down to verse 3, Daniel distinguished himself, being a man of excellent in spirit, and the king gave him and thought he should be set over the whole realm. Now then, look at verse 4. So the governors and the satraps sought to find fault, some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. Now stop there just for a moment. What they're after is we want to bring Daniel down somehow. We've got to find fault with Daniel, and we're looking for fault with Daniel concerning the kingdom. See, he's running the affairs of the kingdom. He's handling the affairs, the business affairs of the kingdom. And so they look perhaps through the book, so they look through his dealings with people, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error of fault found in him. Verse 5, then these men said, we shall not find any charge against Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. In other words, we're looking through the business affairs of Daniel and how he's handling things in the kingdom, how he's running the show for the king, how he's handling all those people under him. We can't find anything he did wrong. We can't find any fault with him. He seems to be a man of purity where there is no fault. And that explains perhaps his advancement to power, both in the Babylonian Empire and in the Persian Empire. I want to suggest to you that is related to the general life of purity. So if we could open up a window and look into Daniel's life and in his business affairs of how he handled the kingdom, he's a man of purity. They look for fault and they can't find any. That gives me a window to look into in his entire life, that he's a man indeed of purity. And we see that from chapter 1. The Christian is to be pure in his conduct, even in his youth. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 4 and in verse 12. Paul told young Timothy, now, quite often we think in our youth we need to sow our wild oats and we can live wild while we're young. But then when we get older and we mature, we'll settle down and be a little more pure in our life. But God expects people who are Christians to be pure even in their youth. Paul writes to young Timothy, you remember this recently from our Bible studies, let no one despise your youth, but be an example of the believers. Yes, you a young man, Timothy, as a young man, you will be an example to others. Now, we often think older people need to be an example to younger people, and that's true. But Paul is telling Timothy, a young man, you need to be an example of the believer in word and in conduct, in the spirit and faith, and in purity. Timothy, you're an example to others. They can look to you and see you're a person of purity. Let's go to Titus chapter 2, verse 6. Titus chapter 2, just a few pages over in Titus chapter 2, beginning at verse 6. Likewise, the young men, exhort the young men to be sober-minded, in all things showing yourself a pattern of good works, an example, in other words, in doctrine, showing integrity, reverence, and incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned. In other words, Titus, you a young man, just like Timothy, need to be an example to all other people, both young and old. Even in our youth, we can be an example that we are to be pure. As an employee, while we're in Titus 2, look at verses 9 and 10. Look at verse 9. Exhort servants to be obedient to their own masters, well-pleasing in all things, not answering back. Here's the purity now at verse 10. Not pilfering, but showing good fidelity, that they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior in all things. We're to be pure in thought, as well as in action, bringing even our thoughts into captivity to Christ. That is, our thoughts are to be subject to the will of Christ. I want to tell you again, as we said in a previous point, this purity is not a decision to be made in a moment of temptation, but that decision is made long before. Now, I cite Genesis 39. Let's turn over there just briefly to make a point before we go further. Let's go to the case of Joseph in Genesis chapter 39. Purity is not a decision you make on the spur of the moment of temptation. That when the temptation comes and it's strong, then let me think what I'm going to do. Let me think through this. Let me see how I need to react. It seems to me that in Genesis chapter 39, that Joseph was a man who had long before he even met Potiphar's wife, he had made a decision. How do I know that? Look at verse 9. He said, "There is no one greater in the house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you're his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" He already knew it was wickedness. He already knew it was sin against God. And he'd already made his decision, I'm not going to bow to the pressure, long before he ever met her. Daniel was a man of purpose. Daniel was a man of principle. Daniel was a man of purity. But I also want to tell you, Daniel was a man of prayer. Daniel was a man of prayer. Let's go to chapter 6 and verse 10. Daniel was indeed strong in prayer. Daniel was a man who was strong in prayer. Let's look at chapter 6 and in verse 10. Let's set the context, and then we'll look at verse 10 and analyze some things we see in verse 10. The context is, as they are concerned, looking for fault. We just read that a moment ago. Can we find fault? And they look through all his business dealings. Well, you don't see anything wrong with him. Well, we got an idea, though. We might find fault with him if we had a law that he violated concerning obeying his God, because he seems to be a man that wants to obey his God. So they made a law, and the Persians' law was irrevocable. If they made a law, it couldn't be taken away. They could have a law contradictory to that, but that law couldn't be reversed. So they went before the king and said, "King, we want a law," and I'm paraphrasing, that says that if anyone makes a petition to any other god other than to you, be cast in the lion's den. The king signs off on it, becomes law. Now verse 10. When Daniel knew the writing was signed, that's now law. You can't petition any being, any god other than the king. Daniel knows that. He went home, and in the upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and he prayed and he gave thanks to God, as was his custom since the early days. I want to suggest to you that first of all, he opened his windows. Rather than Daniel closing the windows, and maybe no one will ever take notice of this, he opened his windows. Tell me that being a man of prayer, he was unashamed and not embarrassed at all to be praying to his God. Not only did he open his windows, he knelt down, suggesting perhaps humility and submission to his God. That he's bowing before this God and not bowing before the king. I'll not bow to that pressure, I'll bow to my God. Notice at verse 10, he did that 3 times that same day. Daniel didn't reason that I prayed to God this morning, I'm not going to do it again lest I get in trouble. But he recognized his continual dependence upon his God. The text says that when he prayed to God, he gave thanks to God. He never lost sight of his blessings. In the midst of this threat, he never lost sight of his blessings from God. I don't know about you, but I might be making a greater plea. I might be crying out in desperation to God. They're about to throw me into the lion's den. But he's offering thanks to God. Never lost sight of his blessings. And the text says he was doing this as it was his custom since the early days. That tells me about his faithfulness and his dedication all through his life. This is not some religion he got toward the end of his life. It's not something he had in his early life, but now he's lost it. But this is the same man that we saw in the early days. We still see him, that same man, in his old age. In chapter 6 and in verse 10. And I want to suggest to you that every Christian should follow Daniel. The strongest of Christians practice prayer. It's not just for those that are weak. They need prayer. The strongest of Christians, just like Daniel was a strong man, and yet he needed prayer. We ought to pray often. Daniel was one who prayed 3 times that day, as was his custom. That wasn't something, I'll pray 3 times today. I don't normally do that, but I'm going to do it today because of the petition. That was his custom since the early days. He'd done that a lot. Let's go to Psalm 55. David was a man like Daniel. Psalm 55, some have referred to this as the Psalm of the sore distressed. I believe it was Jensen who called it the Psalm of the sore distressed. In time of trouble. And notice at verse 17, he said, evening and morning and noon I will pray and I will cry aloud. David was a man of prayer. He prayed often. Go to Colossians with me to chapter 4 and in verse 2. Colossians chapter 4 and in verse 2. The Apostle Paul writes to the Colossians concerning their dedication and their devotion to the Lord. Verse 2 said, continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving. Paul would tell the Thessalonians to pray without ceasing. We should never lose confidence in prayer. Let's go to Luke chapter 18. This is the most interesting connection to me. Look at Luke chapter 18 and in verse 1. Jesus spoke a parable, the text says. I'm not even going to look at the parable at the moment. But the text says he spoke a parable to this end that men ought always to pray and never lose heart. Men ought to pray and keep praying. Then in verse 8, when he finishes the parable, he raises the question, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on earth? Do you see a connection? Is he talking about prayer and then suddenly he turns and he's going to talk about faith? Unrelated, that's a different subject. I've shifted subjects, I've shifted gear, and we're not talking about, or no, he's talking about the same thing. In other words, when the Son of Man comes, will he find men on earth who still have faith that's strong enough they're continuing to pray to God? That's the point. That's the point of the parable. And I want to tell you that when we pray like Daniel and we pray like David, and we pray like Luke 18 talks about, that will affect our purpose and our principle and our purity. What do you know about Daniel? Well, there's a great deal about Daniel we haven't talked about yet. But Daniel is the kind of man we ought to dare to be just like him. Strive to imitate his example. What do you know about Daniel? Daniel was a man of purpose. Daniel was a man of principle. He was a man of purity, and he was a man of prayer. Would you dare to be like a Daniel? Would you purpose in your heart, I'm going to follow the will of God and I'm not going to turn from it? I have principle. I'm not going to back away from that principle. I'm going to stick to my guns. I'm going to be pure. When people look and try to find fault, they won't be able to find any, and then be a person of prayer where 3 times a day he's praying to God despite any prohibition against it. He's still going to do that very thing. A man of purpose, a man of principle, a man of purity, and a man of prayer. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come? All together we stand while we sing.